I didn't want to update till I spoke with Brandy, but I didn't realize how much time had passed since my last post, and I don't want anyone thinking I have dropped off the face of the earth. Or worse. My intention was to have the interviews with Cody and Brandy posted back to back, but it doesn't look like that's going to happen. I guess I have to bite the bullet and tell you the most troubling story. I know some of you found it sad that Rebecca ended her life due to what happened to her, but there's someone else I feel suffered a worse fate. It's never been confirmed that Selena or Santiago had anything to do with this, but considering the circumstances, it is hard to believe they didn't either. After spring break of my senior year in high school, everything seemed to be the typical run-of-the-mill nonsense. Most of us were bummed that our reprieve ended so quickly, and some were happy to see their friends again and reminisce the details of their family vacations. Selena, on the other hand, was not her usual arrogant self. I had study hall with her in the cafeteria, and this is when I first noticed something was off about her. Selena's table was near mine, and about 20 minutes into the period, I realized I was able to study. This was unusual because Selena always carried on with her friends, and was a major distraction for everyone who was trying to get their work done. After realizing this sudden change in the atmosphere, I looked over at Selena's table and saw her sitting there with her head down, and her friends trying to console her. I only saw the back of her, but could tell she was sobbing because of how her body was lightly hitching up and down. I wasn't close enough to hear what her friends were saying, but Selena was in such distress that she couldn't control the volume of her voice, so almost every word she said came out choked, but clear.
"That bastard!"
she sobbed. Disgruntled, knowing that the rest of the semester was going to most likely be filled with this typical distractions, I threw down my pencil and just rested my head and my arms on the table. Most teachers would scold students for this type of thing, but the lady we had, her name slips my mind now, didn't care. She was one of those kinds of teachers who always had a stick up their ass and couldn't be bothered dealing with students over minor offenses. With my head resting on my arm, I closed my eyes and just tried to tune out the world around me until the bell rang. But I couldn't have such a luxury, since Selena would intermittently mutter some nonsense and jerk me out of any sleep I was creeping towards.
"I hate the asshole!"
Selena almost screamed, making me jump. I didn't care to give it much thought at first, but then I started wondering who she was talking about. What first came to mind was that maybe Cody sold her out on the whole Rebecca incident, but the more I listened to her, the more it became clear that something else had got her goat.
"I can't believe he would do that, after everything I've done for him."
This is what really caught my attention. The idea of Selena being selfless was laughable. "What do you want to do?" one of her friends asked. This was actually a bit pleasing to listen to. Looks like poor little Selena got herself into some trouble her daddy can't help her out of. For the remainder of the period, Selena continued with her crocodile tears. At some point within the last 10 minutes of study hall, she said something that really caught my attention. I don't know what led to her saying this, since all I could hear was mumbling from her friends. Also, I just lost interest and stopped listening.
"Handful."
I know the word itself is unassuming, but it was the drastic shift in tone in her voice that made my ears perk up. Instead of sounding wet and choked, Selena's voice took on a dark and almost boyish tone. I picked my head up to check the time, then looked from the clock to Selena's table. Her friends were all quiet, and some looked unnerved while one of the girls shook her head. By word of mouth, I later found out what it was that upset Selena so much. Abigail. It really is funny how much trouble we get into when we're young. Nothing to the extent that would put some of us on the news, but even the most inane situations we got ourselves into made us feel like we would never see the light of day again. I wish that was the same problem for Rebecca, but even more so for Abigail. I would be remiss if I didn't tell you all how good of a person Abigail was. She was the kind of girl who had a genuine concern for others, no matter their faults. I remember a few times over the years, she approached me, I think the first time was in 6th grade, and asked me if I was okay. I told her, yeah, why? And she would always say how she wanted to make sure because I'm always so quiet. I couldn't help but take this as flirting after the first couple of times. I also recall this one time in 8th grade when our history teacher, Mrs. Bowers, was going through a nasty divorce. Somehow Abigail caught wind of it and would always take time to talk to Mrs. Bowers after class to console her. I think maybe it was Mrs. Bowers who may have told Abigail, because that's the kind of trusting affection she had on people. Now, I don't want to get into the whole thing about religion because it's never been something that's interested me, but Abigail was raised Christian, and I believe she acted like one should. The famous quote about Abigail was, "She has the body of an angel and a personality to match." Also, this is a bit embarrassing to admit, but I had a crush on her for about 4 months. I finally built up the courage to ask her out, and when I did, she just giggled and good-humoredly and told me she's flattered but has too much going on in her life for anything serious. I know a lot of girls say stuff like that as a kind of way of saying no, but Abigail was one of the rare types who actually meant what she said. After we exchanged a few more words, she told me how sweet it was of me to ask, then gave me a brief hug and said she would be more than happy to be friends, and actually would have been happy with that. I don't know how that girl found all the time to do the things she did, but somehow she pulled through, volunteered at the local animal shelter, worked with the handicapped students at school, played on the softball team, organized almost all of the major and even minor events at the school. Hell, she was even school president for a couple years. I wonder if schools still do that today. I don't know if I should really write all this about Abigail, considering how everyone responded to Rebecca, but no matter how good someone may be, we all know what happens in the end. It's like what's said in that Primus song, "Tragedies are coming." It's funny how our minds get conditioned to certain things, so much so we don't even acknowledge something anymore because of how we are so used to it being part of our lives. You only notice that particular something when it's suddenly not there anymore. That's what happened to me when I got on the bus one morning. Abigail always sat near the back of the bus with her few friends that rode with her. It's not that they carried on excessively like Selena and her friends would, but I would still hear Abigail let out an excited squeak or laugh intermittently during our trip to school. She was subtle but loud enough that I still heard her, but it was just white noise. Except for that morning. She was at her loudest when I realized I didn't hear her at all. I noticed this by the time we were almost to school, so I got curious and looked at the back of the bus. Abigail wasn't there, but her friends were. One was sitting next to a crying girl with her arm around her shoulders, consoling her. I didn't watch much of TV back then and still don't, so I missed the news the previous night. During homeroom, before the teacher arrived and everyone was getting settled in, I was talking to a friend of mine, David. I was trying to initiate the typical small talk we usually have, and he cut me off.
Dude, did you hear the news last night?
What news? I asked. David waved a hand at me.
That's right, you don't watch TV.
Well, don't leave me hanging, what's up? David lowered his voice to a whisper.
You know that Christian girl, Abigail?
I nodded my head. David then put his thumb to his neck and made a cutthroat motion across it. I tilted my head like a confused dog. Then Dave shook his head.
Dude, she's dead.
He whispered. What do you mean, dead? Dave started to speak, but then the teacher, Mr. Watson, came in. He set his things in order at his desk, then stood there and called for the class's attention.
I'm sure some of you may already have heard the unfortunate news, but your schoolmate Abigail Thompson was found murdered over the weekend. There will be an assembly held in her honor at noon today. It's not mandatory to go, and for those of you who wished not to attend, are to go to study hall until the assembly ends. But everyone is encouraged to go. Due to protocol, I cannot give any details of what happened, so there is no point in asking me or any of the other staff any questions. And for those of you who may know anything, are to keep it to yourselves. Anyone caught doing otherwise will face suspension.
Mr. Watson took his seat and a loud murmur erupted among the class. It had been so long since I saw Selena's meltdown in study hall, I didn't even think of making a connection at the time. I didn't want to push my luck discussing the issue in front of Mr. Watson, so I waited until after school to discuss it with Dave. but I did make one attempt when Mr. Watson stepped out during homeroom, but Dave quickly waved his hand and mouthed the word, later. Even though it was a choice, I decided I had nothing better to do and went to the assembly for Abigail. The auditorium was surprisingly full and almost every student in my grade was there. The principal came up to the podium and gave a eulogy for Abigail, then went into a speech about how we're supposed to be good to each other and help those who are in need. During the eulogy, I heard someone giggling a few seats behind me. Brushed it off at first, but when it persisted, I was tempted to look over my shoulder. Selena was sitting with her friends with a crooked smile on her face and tears in her eyes. Her laughter became so loud that she had to leave the auditorium, chuckling into her cupped hand. Later that day, after we were let off at our bus stop, Dave gave me the details of what he heard on the news on our way home.
She was found with her stomach cut open.
Bullshit, I said. Dave shook his head.
It was on the news.
Why would someone do that? Dave shrugged his shoulders.
That's what they're still trying to figure out. Hard to imagine a girl like Abigail having many enemies.
For as bad as this news was, I had nothing further to add to the conversation, so I asked David if he would like to go to my place and play video games.
I would, but my mom has me on lockdown until they catch the killer. She said if I come home late, one time, then I'll have to hand over my phone for a month.
As we approached my house, Dave and I said our farewells and I went inside. Dinner wasn't too bad, but my parents kept wanting to talk about what they heard on the news about Abigail. As it so happens, my parents put me on a leash as well. It was a nice day at school the next day, so our PE teacher, Mrs. Redfield, decided to let us have the class on a football field. After doing a few laps, we played a game of kickball for what was supposed to be the remainder of the period. This is when I noticed something about Jake, the captain of the wrestling team. While he wasn't the type that looked for trouble, like some of the other upper-class students at school, he was still in the same league of notoriety. Other than wrestling, Jake was very active in other athletics as well, and he treated a game of kickball like it was hopscotch. He was always on the winning team because he always won for the team. But that day was different. Jake was unfocused, and for someone who couldn't hold in his words during a game, he was completely absent of sound. Several times when a ball came in his direction, somebody else had to shout out his name so he would take notice and make a kick, which ended in either missing or kicking the ball in the wrong direction. Mrs. Redfield was a very kind person and took notice of this, so she told the class to do more laps while she took Jake aside between the bleachers. Not that I cared, but I couldn't help catching glances of the two of them talking every time I ran in their direction around the field. What I noticed was Mrs. Redfield trying to talk to Jake, and him seeming evasive. His head would shake or he would wave her off and try to walk away, only for her to gently grab him by the arm and convince him to stay. Then something happened that made all of us turn our heads. Jake was heard for the first time during class, going ballistic, and said something to Mrs. Redfield along the lines of, "Fuck off, I can't talk about it." Of course, an incident like this just can't go untouched amongst teenagers, and people had a lot of questions. Jake was actually one of the few jovial kids at school, and always seemed to stay on people's good side. He was just a regular guy trying to enjoy life. As I've stated before, I've always tried to stay ignorant of other people's business, so I didn't think of putting two and two together at the time. During lunch the next day, I was talking to David about what happened, and he raised his hands, palms up in the air.
Seriously, does it stay cool under that fucking rock you live under?
What did I miss now? I asked. David shook his head and rolled his eyes.
Abigail and Jake were dating. They were pretty serious, too. Talking about marriage after graduation and all that shit.
David then gave me the details. He said what happened was that Selena had a crush on Jake, which was typical of her. She had new crushes at least twice a month from what I've heard. Selena knew Jake had a commitment, but she didn't care. Selena gets what Selena wants, and that's how things worked in her world. Jake accidentally got Abigail pregnant, and the both of them decided to keep the baby, since they were in their last year of public school, and the baby wouldn't come for another few months after graduation. Now that I think about it, I do remember Abigail showing a little bit, but just thought that she was putting on a few pounds. When Selena found out, she went crazy with jealousy. The bastard she was crying about in study hall wasn't Jake, but her father, because he refused to help her with this particular issue. She wasn't in any kind of trouble, and the situation posed no threat to Santiago and his family, so he considered it childish and a waste of time. I don't know what kind of strings Selena pulled to get her way, but I've speculated that maybe she talked to some friends into helping her commit the murder. Abigail's corpse was found in a garbage dump 2 towns away from where she lived. She had bruises around her neck from being strangled, and a petrified look of terror was frozen on her face. Her stomach was cut open and the fetus was removed, never to be found. And that word I heard Selena say with so much malice in study hall, she didn't say handful. She said landfill.